If you could discover why your mind works in a specific way that makes it almost impossible to forgive certain experiences from your past, it would completely change how you deal with your emotional wounds. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychologist who revolutionized our understanding of the human psyche, discovered something extraordinary about how different personality types process trauma and forgiveness in completely distinct ways. Before we continue this journey of self-discovery that can transform your life, subscribe to the channel and leave your like. These Jung discoveries can literally change your relationship with your own past, and you won't want to miss any insight that could revolutionize your existence. Jung spent decades studying the deep patterns of the human mind and made a discovery that shocked the scientific community of his time. He realized that our capacity to forgive isn't just a matter of willpower, kindness, or spiritual evolution. It's a matter of how our psyche is structured from birth. He identified that people with different mental configurations face unique and specific obstacles when trying to free themselves from painful experiences. Have you ever wondered why some people seem to be able to overcome devastating trauma with apparent ease, while others get stuck in endless cycles of resentment for years, decades, or even their entire lifetime? Jung discovered this isn't coincidence. It's not because some people were born stronger, kinder, or more spiritually evolved. It's because different psychological types possess completely different internal mechanisms for processing, storing, and eventually releasing emotional pain. The INFJ, INFP, INTJ, and INTP types represent four of the most complex and fascinating mental configurations Jung identified in his studies. These types share something extraordinary. They're all introverted and intuitive, which means they live primarily in rich and complex internal worlds, processing information through patterns, meanings, and possibilities that most people don't even perceive. But each of these types has a unique and specific way of filtering, interpreting, and storing traumatic experiences in their psyche. And here's the revolutionary secret Jung discovered. The key to true forgiveness isn't fighting against your fundamental psychological nature, trying to force your mind to function in a way that goes against its natural structure. The key is understanding deeply how your mind actually works, and then using that understanding to work with your nature, not against it. Think for a moment about experiences from your past that still cause sharp pain when you remember them. Maybe it's a devastating betrayal from someone you trusted completely. Maybe it's a humiliating rejection that happened in front of other people. Maybe it's a moment when you felt completely misunderstood and unjustly judged. Or maybe it's something even deeper, a wound that touched the core of your identity and fundamentally changed how you see yourself and the world. Now observe carefully how your mind processes that painful memory. Do you relive the emotional details with an intensity that seems to transport you back in time? Do you obsessively analyze every word, every gesture, every nuance of what happened, trying to understand where everything went wrong? Do you create elaborate and complex narratives about the deep meaning of that event and its implications for your future life? Do you get lost in mental labyrinths trying to logically solve something that might not have a logical solution? Jung discovered that each psychological type has a characteristic and predictable way of getting stuck in the past. And more importantly, each type has a specific and unique key to freeing themselves from these mental prisons they construct. The problem is that most people try to forgive using generic methods that work against their natural psychological structure, and that's why they fail repeatedly, creating even more frustration and self-condemnation. What makes this even more fascinating is that Jung realized these patterns aren't random. They're deeply connected to how each type's cognitive functions operate. The way you perceive information, process emotions, make decisions, and organize your inner world all influence how you experience and store traumatic memories. Understanding this connection is the first step towards psychological freedom. Let's start by exploring the fascinating and complex internal world of the INFJ. If you're an INFJ, your mind works like a highly sophisticated emotional archaeologist. You don't just remember what happened in a traumatic situation, you remember the entire emotional landscape that surrounded the event. You remember the feeling in the environment, the unspoken tensions that hung in the air, the hidden meanings behind people's words, the subtle connections between this event and larger patterns you perceive in human nature. When someone hurts you deeply, your mind automatically initiates a complex process of searching for hidden patterns and connections. You can't simply accept that something bad happened and move on. Your psyche needs to understand the why, needs to find the deeper meaning, needs to connect this experience with your greater understanding of how the world works and how people really are beneath their social masks. Jung called this dominant introverted intuition combined with auxiliary extroverted feeling. What this means in practical terms is that your mind is constantly trying to understand the deeper meaning and future implications of your experiences, while simultaneously absorbing and processing the emotional impact of everything happening around you. When trauma occurs, you don't just process the event itself, you process all the symbolic meanings, all the implications for your future relationships, all the ways this experience connects to your deeper understanding of human nature. This dual processing creates a unique challenge for INFJs. You're not just dealing with the immediate pain of what happened, you're dealing with the existential implications of what it means about humanity, relationships, and your place in the world. Your mind creates intricate webs of meaning around traumatic events, and these webs can become psychological traps that keep you bound to the past. This is why forgiveness is so challenging for INFJs. You're not trying to forgive just an isolated action, you're trying to forgive an entire complex web of meanings and implications that your mind has constructed around that action. Your intuitive mind sees patterns everywhere, and when someone hurts you, it immediately starts predicting how this pattern of behavior will repeat in the future, how this reveals something fundamental about that person's character, how this connects to other patterns of betrayal or disappointment you've observed in humanity. But here's what Jung discovered about the INFJ's specific path to true forgiveness. You need to use your natural gift for seeing deeper meanings in a completely different way. Instead of using your intuition to predict future pain and build mental defenses, you need to use it to understand the deeper psychological wounds in the person who hurt you. INFJs possess an extraordinary capacity for psychological insight. When you truly understand why someone acted the way they did, when you can see the unhealed wounds, the unconscious fears, the destructive patterns that person inherited from their own traumatic history, forgiveness stops being a struggle and becomes not just possible, but inevitable. The key for INFJs is to make a fundamental shift in consciousness, move from victim consciousness to healer consciousness. When you start seeing the person who hurt you as someone who was acting from their own unhealed wounds, your natural compassion is activated. You stop taking that person's actions personally against you and start seeing them as symptoms of their psychological state. This shift requires you to expand your perspective beyond the immediate situation and see the larger patterns of human suffering and healing. Your intuitive gifts allow you to perceive the interconnectedness of all human experience, and when you apply this perception to forgiveness, you begin to see how everyone's pain is connected to everyone else's pain. Now let's explore the unique and complex emotional universe of the INFP. If you're an INFP, your relationship with past trauma is completely different from the INFJ experience. Your mind works like an emotional artist, painting vivid and detailed internal landscapes of feeling and meaning. When someone hurts you, you don't just remember the facts of what happened, you remember the entire emotional symphony that played in your inner world during that experience. Jung identified that INFPs possess dominant introverted feeling, which means your internal emotional world is incredibly rich, nuanced, and complex. When trauma occurs, it doesn't just create a memory in your psyche, it creates an entire emotional ecosystem. You might find yourself returning to that internal landscape repeatedly, not because you want to, but because your mind is trying to process all the emotional complexity of what happened. The unique challenge for INFPs is that your natural empathy makes you absorb not just your own pain, but the pain of everyone involved in the traumatic situation. You feel the pain you experienced, but you also feel guilty about any pain your reaction might have caused other people. You feel anger about the injustice of what happened, but you also feel sad for the person who hurt you because you can sense their own internal wounds. This emotional complexity is simultaneously your greatest gift and your greatest challenge when it comes to forgiveness. Jung discovered that INFPs often struggle with forgiveness because they're trying to forgive not just the action that hurt them, but the entire complex emotional web they've created around that action. You're trying to forgive your own sensitivity, your own reactions, your own inability to protect yourself and the other person's actions, all at the same time. What makes this even more complicated is that INFPs have an internal value system that's incredibly important to them. When someone violates your values, it's not just a personal attack, it's an attack on what you believe makes life meaningful and beautiful. The trauma isn't just about what happened to you, it's about the violation of principles that you hold sacred. Your mind creates elaborate internal narratives about the meaning of traumatic events, and these narratives often involve themes of good versus evil, authenticity versus falseness, love versus hate. You don't just process events, you process them through the lens of your deepest values and beliefs about how the world should work. The path to forgiveness for INFPs involves what Jung called emotional integration. You need to honor all the different feelings you have about the situation without trying to resolve them into a single, simple, and harmonious emotion. Your mind naturally wants to create harmony and resolve internal conflicts, but sometimes the path to peace involves accepting that you can feel multiple contradictory emotions about the same person or situation. For INFPs, forgiveness isn't about getting rid of your feelings or pretending they don't matter. It's about accepting the full spectrum of your emotional experience and choosing to act from love, despite the complexity of what you feel. Your natural compassion is your superpower, but you need to learn to extend that same compassion to yourself and your own emotional process. The key is understanding that you don't need to resolve all your feelings about a situation in order to forgive. You can feel anger and compassion simultaneously. You can feel pain and gratitude for the growth that came from that pain. You can feel disappointment and hope at the same time. Forgiveness for INFPs is about embracing this emotional complexity instead of fighting against it. This process requires you to develop what Jung called emotional maturity. This doesn't mean becoming less sensitive or caring less deeply. It means learning to hold space for all of your emotions without being overwhelmed by them. It means recognizing that your emotional responses are valid and important, even when they seem contradictory. The breakthrough for INFPs often comes when you realize that forgiveness is actually an expression of your deepest values, not a betrayal of them. When you choose to forgive, you're choosing love over hate, healing over harm, growth over stagnation. You're living according to your highest principles, even in the face of pain. Now, let's explore the INTJ's unique approach to trauma and forgiveness. If you're an INTJ, your mind works like a strategic architect, constantly building and rebuilding internal models of how the world works. When someone hurts you, your mind immediately starts analyzing the situation, looking for patterns, trying to understand the underlying systems and motivations that led to this outcome. Jung identified that INTJs possess dominant introverted intuition combined with auxiliary extroverted thinking. This means your mind is constantly trying to understand the deeper patterns of reality while simultaneously organizing and systematizing your understanding. When trauma occurs, your mind doesn't just process the emotional impact, it processes the strategic implications. You start asking questions like, what does this tell me about this person's character? What does this reveal about my own blind spots? How can I prevent this from happening again? What systems do I need to implement to protect myself? Your mind immediately starts building defenses and creating strategies to avoid similar pain in the future. This analytical approach is simultaneously your strength and your challenge when it comes to forgiveness. On one hand, your ability to understand the deeper patterns and motivations behind people's actions can lead to genuine insight and compassion. On the other hand, your strategic mind can get stuck in endless analysis, trying to solve the problem of the past instead of accepting and moving forward. Jung discovered that INTJs often struggle with forgiveness because they're trying to make logical sense of something that might not have a logical explanation. You want to understand exactly why someone acted the way they did, what their motivations were, how the situation could have been handled differently. But sometimes people act from unconscious wounds, irrational fears, or simple human weakness that doesn't fit into a neat analytical framework. What makes this particularly challenging for INTJs is that your mind is designed to create efficient systems and eliminate problems. When you can't solve the problem of past trauma through analysis and strategy, it creates a kind of cognitive dissonance. Your mind keeps returning to the problem, trying to find a solution that doesn't exist. The path to forgiveness for INTJs involves what Jung called strategic acceptance. You need to use your natural gift for seeing the big picture to zoom out far enough that the specific traumatic event becomes just one data point in a much larger pattern of human behavior and psychological development. For INTJs, forgiveness often comes through understanding that holding on to resentment is strategically counterproductive. When you realize that staying angry is actually preventing you from achieving your larger goals and living according to your deeper values, your strategic mind naturally starts looking for ways to release that anger. The key is to reframe forgiveness not as an emotional process, but as a strategic decision. You're not forgiving because you feel like it. You're forgiving because it's the most effective way to reclaim your mental energy and focus on what really matters to you. This approach allows you to use your natural strengths in service of healing. Instead of fighting against your analytical nature, you're using it to make a rational decision about what serves your long-term interests. You're applying your strategic thinking to the problem of psychological freedom. The breakthrough for INTJs often comes when you realize that forgiveness is actually the most logical choice. When you calculate the cost of holding on to resentment versus the benefits of letting go, the strategic choice becomes clear. Your mind can then commit to forgiveness as the optimal strategy for achieving your goals. Finally, let's explore the unique relationship INTPs have with trauma and forgiveness. If you're an INTP, your mind works like a philosophical detective, constantly questioning, analyzing, and trying to understand the deeper principles underlying your experiences. When someone hurts you, your mind immediately starts deconstructing the situation, looking for the underlying logic, trying to understand the psychological and philosophical implications. Jung identified that INTPs possess dominant introverted thinking, which means your mind is constantly trying to understand the logical structure of reality. When trauma occurs, you don't just feel the pain, you start questioning everything. You question the other person's motivations, you question your own reactions, you question the nature of human relationships, you question whether forgiveness is even a coherent concept. This questioning nature is simultaneously your gift and your challenge. Your ability to see through surface appearances and understand the deeper logical structures of human behavior can lead to profound insights. But your mind can also get stuck in endless analysis, questioning every aspect of the situation without ever reaching a conclusion that feels satisfactory. INTPs often struggle with forgiveness because they're trying to solve it like a logical puzzle. You want to understand exactly what forgiveness means, whether it's philosophically justified, what the logical steps are, how you can know when you've truly forgiven someone. But forgiveness isn't a logical problem to be solved. It's a psychological process to be experienced. What makes this particularly challenging for INTPs is that your mind is designed to understand systems and principles. When you encounter something that doesn't fit into a clear, logical framework, it creates a kind of intellectual frustration. Your mind keeps trying to categorize and understand forgiveness in rational terms, but forgiveness often transcends rational categories. Jung discovered that the path to forgiveness for INTPs involves what he called philosophical acceptance. You need to use your natural gift for seeing the bigger picture to understand that forgiveness is not about logical consistency, it's about psychological freedom. For INTPs, the breakthrough often comes when you realize that holding on to resentment is actually intellectually limiting. When you're stuck in anger about past events, your mind becomes less flexible, less curious, less able to explore new ideas and possibilities. Forgiveness becomes not an emotional imperative, but an intellectual one. The key for INTPs is to approach forgiveness as an experiment in consciousness. Instead of trying to figure out whether you should forgive, try forgiving and observe what happens to your mental state. Use your natural curiosity to explore how different approaches to forgiveness affect your ability to think clearly and pursue your intellectual interests. This experimental approach allows you to use your natural strengths in service of healing. Instead of getting stuck in analysis paralysis, you're using your analytical abilities to gather data about what works and what doesn't. You're applying the scientific method to your own psychological development. Here's what Jung understood that most people miss. Forgiveness isn't a one-size-fits-all process. Each psychological type needs to approach forgiveness in a way that aligns with their natural mental processes. INFJs need to use their intuitive understanding of human psychology. INFPs need to honor their emotional complexity while choosing love. INTJs need to see forgiveness as a strategic decision that serves their larger goals. INTPs need to approach forgiveness as an intellectual experiment in consciousness. But here's the deeper secret Jung discovered. Regardless of your type, forgiveness ultimately isn't about the other person at all. It's about reclaiming your own psychological freedom. When you're stuck in resentment, you're giving someone else control over your internal state. You're allowing their past actions to continue influencing your present experience. True forgiveness, according to Jung, is the recognition that you have the power to choose your response to any situation, regardless of what happened in the past. It's not about condoning harmful behavior or pretending that painful experiences didn't matter. It's about reclaiming your agency and choosing to live from your highest values rather than your deepest wounds. This understanding transforms forgiveness from a moral obligation into a practical tool for psychological liberation. You're not forgiving because you're supposed to be a good person. You're forgiving because it's the most effective way to free yourself from the past and create the future you want. The most powerful thing you can do right now is to identify your psychological type and start experimenting with the forgiveness approach that aligns with your natural mental processes. Stop trying to forgive the way other people tell you to forgive. Start forgiving in the way that makes sense for how your mind actually works. Your past doesn't have to define your future. Your wounds don't have to become your identity. Jung showed us that understanding our psychological nature is the first step toward transcending our limitations and living with genuine freedom. What past experience are you ready to approach with this new understanding? What would change in your life if you could truly forgive and move forward? The answers to these questions might surprise you, and they definitely have the power to transform your entire relationship with your own history.